As academic institutions are working to prevent Indigenous identity fraud, Dalhousie University in Halifax recently released a report called Understanding Our Roots, Task Force on Settler Misappropriation of Indigenous Identity. The report includes recommendations to verify Indigenous identity of faculty, students, and staff, and investigate suspected cases of identity fraud. Concerned how the verification process may violate human rights and research ethics, two Mi'kmaq law professors from the university, Naomi Mtalik and Cheryl Simon, wrote a 75-page human rights and legal analysis of the report. They spoke to Sav Jonza earlier.
Welcome, Naomi and Cheryl. After Dalhousie published their report to prevent Indigenous identity fraud, what led to writing the human rights and legal analysis?
Well, I'll start. Well, after reading it, I think we both noticed and had talked, and I was talking to some other people as well, that there was a lot of gaps missing, and we had a lot of concerns in terms of the narrow categories that were chosen for who is Indigenous. And with our backgrounds, I've done a lot of work on Indigenous identity stuff, Section 35 cases, also some equality stuff. And to me, there were some really big gaps and also some concerns about the process as well and hearing about implementation. So those were all reasons that after trying to raise flags and not getting very far, we decided we needed to write something.
And where did the task force on settler misappropriation of identity go wrong?
Well, I think that there were several process issues that the task force took that could have been more full. For instance, there was a lot of focus on the local Indigenous community, which is Mi'kmaq people we absolutely support because this is Mi'kmaq territory. But it's important to remember that Dalhousie as an institution has Indigenous peoples from across the country, from the United States, from different just from different international tribes and nations as well. And that wasn't reflected in the report and the consultation process.
Yeah, and I think on the substance part of it, just to add on, I think it's that it's trying to treat the issue of fraudulent misappropriation of identity by non-Indigenous peoples. It's trying to sort of use that brush to people who kind of fall in the, it uses mostly status and federally recognized entities as the basis for who's Indigenous, but there's a whole range of folks in the middle of between, people who have status or are recognized as First Nations, and versus, white people who are fraudulently pretending to be Indigenous. There's a whole range of folks, and we're not saying all of that range, but we're saying there's a significant chunk of that range who are Indigenous and who are not covered. I mean, for me, the one that was the biggest concern and remains the biggest concern is because of the Indian Act second generation cutoff rule, which says that all kids born after 1985 who only have one status Indian parent, they're no longer status Indians. There's a whole bunch of kids like that and grandkids today on First Nations all over Canada. And those kids, according to the report, wouldn't be eligible unless their band has a membership code that recognizes them. And that sounds great on paper, but only like 40% or even 30% of bands actually have membership codes. And most of them use the Indian Act rules. So those kids would still be excluded anyway. But they are, our kids and our grandkids.
That's some great points. Dalhousie admits there are professors with false claims to Indigenous identity who have benefited professionally and financially. Should they be charged with fraud? Why or why not?
Well, I think the process of academic fraud has already been established in the university. And so when it comes to the consequences of, committing academic fraud, those processes need to be utilized. So whether or not, there's ever any kind of criminal liability with it, that's a separate issue. But with respect to people that are advancing their careers on these fraudulent identities, we need to make sure that it's actual fraud and not just people that colonialism has had an impact on their families and their communities and their nations, because there's a distinct difference there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're not saying don't go after frauds, but we're saying it's a lot more complicated than a lot of people think it is. And it really requires us to kind of have a really good understanding of how the Indian Act and other colonial policies have been used over time with the purpose of extinguishing us as people. And that in ways, like I just described about the second generation cutoff rule, it's still doing that. And so we need to be wise to that and see that. And so when we look at, who is doing that, they're making real distinctions between white people who are knowingly pretending they're Indigenous people for gain, and then Indigenous people who have complicated identities, who don't necessarily have status, but there's more to it than just saying they're frauds. That's really what we care about here, and what we're really worried about on our report and some of the other universities that have acted on this, that it's missing that really important nuance, which is actually sort of aiding colonial policies or strategies that were aimed at genocide.
And our communities are so vulnerable because of the genocide that we've experienced and the impacts of the Indian Act, that we have to make sure that Indigenous peoples are not assumed to be guilty while they're undertaking these processes. We need to take a trauma-informed approach to this issue and make sure that we are not causing more harm as we explore this issue in order to identify people that actually have committed an academic fraud.
And what has Dalhousie's reaction been?
Well, we wrote the report, we sent it to them, and we've made it public just because we didn't feel that concerns were really being addressed. And so we met with them. We are hoping that they're going to be open to thinking about what we wrote and the categories and the sort of nuances we're trying to bring to this. We don't know yet. We don't know yet, but we think this is an important discussion, not just to have at our institution, but across the country, because people are feeling a lot of pressure to react to these stories that are coming out about pretendians and fraud. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have our own people who are harmed and vulnerable and who've been affected by colonialism, and we got to make sure that we don't design processes that are going to throw them out in the cold, because that's not how we are.
All right, well, we'll have to end it there, but thank you so much for speaking with us today, Naomi and Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciated it. Thanks.